Hello and welcome to Car Dealer Live. Today we're taking our monthly look at used car values, and I'm joined as ever by CAP HPI Director of Valuations, Darren Martin. Hello, Darren.
Hi, James.
Lovely to have you on. Thanks so much for joining us as always. Let us get straight to it then. I mean, what's the latest on values in June?
So the value movement in June, so in our live values, is a 0.9% decrease at that 3-year 60,000 mile point that we kind of benchmark at, which is about £120 down. So it's slightly more than last month, but very similar. So last month it went 0.7, this time it's 0.9. And remember, that's off the back of 2 heavy months in March and April. So we're seeing that sort of plateauing of values again.
Yeah, and I know that's something you've predicted, that we'd see a bit of a leveling off in terms of the values. And I mean, what are the reasons for this plateau we're seeing at the moment?
Well, it's down to that sort of really, well, we've never really experienced it before, where you've got low demand, generally low consumer demand, not horrendous, but it is lower than normal, and you've got low supply. So you don't normally have those two dynamics, and that's what's causing. They're quite well matched, really. So it's causing that sort of plateauing effect. Normally, you either get where you can have supply and high and demand high, or you can have sort of supply high and demand low, and then that's when values come down. But at the moment, because of the dynamics in the new car market and a lack of fleet returns and that type of thing, that you've got. You've just got not an abundance of cars out there, but also the demand is lower, so they're evening each other out to a degree. But there's lots of moving parts within those live values, obviously.
Yes, of course. And but I have to admit, I mean, when we talk about low supply and low demand, I would expect that would equate to even greater drop than just 0.9. I mean, it's still the market's still strong though, isn't it?
It's okay. Yeah, for a month of June, that's one of the strongest Junes that we've experienced over the last sort of 10 years. So generally, when you look back at what happens in June, I would say the norm is maybe a 1.4% drop. So it's 0.5% stronger than sort of more normal times. Obviously, you can't compare to this time last year. We were in that summer of strength this time last year when values were going crazy. But yeah, overall, it's a reasonably strong market. But I think if you speak to dealers, they probably would say it's not great for them. They're having to work really hard to get to sort of stimulate demand and to close sales off, just because of that sort of cost of living squeeze and demand being affected. And we're into holiday season as well. So. And which will soon ramp up with the school holidays starting. So yeah, it's tougher out there, but values aren't dropping, which should give dealers a bit of confidence to buy cars for stock.
Yeah, and of course we've got to remember, as we've spoken about lots in the past, that prices increased by nearly 30% last year, didn't they? So we still, even though it's plateauing out, we've had a couple of months of lower values, it's still an unusually strong market, and it's going to take a long time for it to get back to where it was pre-pandemic, isn't it?
Yeah, it really depends on the model, but yeah, there's cars that went up by 60%. I mean, you've got things like the Fiat Punto that's still sort of between 50 and 60% ahead of where it was a year ago. We're looking at values from 3 years ago, and we've got the values are so much higher than they were then. So it's still pretty positive, but we've just had a bit of a realignment over sort of March and April, and then this kind of plateauing over the last couple of months. So, but yeah, values are still strong. Dealers are still doing okay. Margins are okay. They're just having to work harder, and maybe some of that margin has been squeezed recently. But I mean, you've got some dealers that are reducing their prices, trying to encourage demand. But if you think about the cost of living squeeze, if you've got to make such a big ticket purchase, are you going to go out and buy it because someone's reduced it by £500? You're probably not. You're still making that sort of careful decision on, and maybe you're not buying at the moment. Maybe you're going to go on a holiday instead, or maybe you're just being really careful at the moment.
Yeah, and I do think, even though there are, as the well-documented problems in terms of the travel situation at the moment, people generally, the people I talk to, they are prioritizing even though it's an absolute nightmare to get away at the moment, they're prioritizing their finances on having a holiday, as opposed to perhaps treating themselves to a car, which of course which has been the reverse for the past 2 years or so, hasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's I mean, demand isn't horrendous, as I say, but yeah, that's certainly affecting things. And if you everywhere you read, the cost of living squeeze is there, so it probably does make you think. But as I say, we've spoken to dealers who are doing okay, but they're having to work harder for it, and some aren't doing quite as well. But yeah, the sales rates for some are pretty healthy, but it's just not as good as they probably budgeted it to be, or would normally be at this time of year.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's still early days, but are you really starting to see consumer confidence taking a dent in demand now?
Yeah, it has. Yeah, I mean, it's not, as I say, it's not horrendous, but yeah, it has had an impact, and we are of the dealers we speak to, they are saying that it is harder, and that consumers are staying away. And yeah, I think there's different areas of the market as well. We've seen drops at that lower end where maybe people are more affected by cost of living squeeze. Those sort of under £5,000 cars, which have been really, really strong, are now they're struggling a little bit more. There seems to be a sweet spot of around sort of £12,000, and so maybe people are shying away from those cars at about 20,000 that went up by quite a lot and look expensive. And at the bottom end, people are more affected by that cost of living squeeze. But at the top end, over £50,000, it's hardly affected at all. People are still buying cars at that top end, and they're probably not so affected by cost of living concerns.
Yeah, that does mark a bit of a change, though, doesn't it? Because in the past we have spoken about it's the middle sector that's being squeezed the most, and it was bookended by two markets which were doing quite well. So that is a bit of a change, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think, as I say, under £5,000 is more affected, but yeah, those ones have been really strong. So maybe they've just reached their level now and can't continue to go up. So they have dropped by about £100, something like that, I think, at that sort of level. So it's not massive, but as I say, I think people excuse me, are more affected by cost of living concerns there. That sort of £12,000 sweet spot, I think that might be because maybe people are coming out of a 30 grand car that's gone up by so much. Maybe for their second car, they don't need that big second car anymore, so they're going into sort of a smaller city car as a second vehicle for those sort of local journeys. So yeah, it's very interesting looking at the data, but we have seen that bottom end slightly more heavily affected, and also there can be some damaged cars in that older sort of 10-year-old range, and dealers aren't really buying damaged cars at the moment. They're keen to buy something that in cap clean condition that they can get on the forecourt quickly, because if cars aren't selling quite as quick at the moment, you want to get it on there quickly anyway. And especially in a slightly falling market, you don't want to have a car that's going to be sitting in the workshop for a few weeks.
Exactly, and of course high prep costs as well. You just don't want that headache, really, do you? Surely the huge costs, the huge price increases we've seen with petrol, that must be having an effect in terms of the fuel types in the used market. I would imagine that electric cars are probably benefiting quite well out of all of this.
Yeah, there's certainly consideration for electric vehicles. Of course, they are quite expensive still, a lot of them, but yeah, we've seen MG ZS go up 5% this month. So although the average movement is a downward one, we've got some electric vehicles that have been going up. So the Corsa Electric's gone up as well. So yeah, it's I think the Kia EV6 has gone up. So yeah, we've definitely seen more consideration for there, and there does seem to be more EVs going up. You can always get the sort of the odd one that bucks the trend, but there seems to be more of a trend, and overall electric vehicles are up this month, and diesel values are down. So diesel, especially at that older age, diesel values have gone down by about double what petrol ones have. So petrol values have gone down, but diesel ones have gone down by more. And I think it's quite a big choice now. If you're going to go for diesel's expensive. It's almost £2 a litre. Do you do the miles to make it worth your while? Do you live near an urban area where potentially they're not going to let you in with a diesel vehicle, clean air zones and things like that? So it's a bit more of a considered decision now to go and buy a diesel. So I think more people are looking for EVs. More people are maybe making that halfway house for a hybrid. And diesels are just a little bit harder work, but that is quite regional as well. So probably if you're in a more rural area, then diesel will still work for you. And if you do the miles, it will still work for you. But you've got to do the miles to make it worth your while. And I think people are just shying away from it to a degree. And obviously, if you're a dealer, would you be buying diesels to load your forecourt with? You're probably just going to be a little bit more careful with that.
Yeah, yeah. I think in many ways, and this is a very general point, but I think in many ways, we're seeing a realignment in terms of diesel, perhaps to levels where it should always have been, where it's a fuel type that is well considered by consumers, as opposed to being the default choice, which it has been for the past 15, 20 years, hasn't it? So, of course, there's a huge amount that's happened, but in many ways, it's a natural sort of realignment, I tend to feel.
Yeah, well, I think as a percentage of the market 20 odd years ago, it was really, really small, wasn't it? So it's been led by the company car tax and legislation. And now, yeah, it probably is finding its level. But again, you can't sort of escape the fact that diesel values have been really strong as well for the last couple of years. So diesel and petrol were matching each other, both gone up by that sort of 30%. So diesel's just coming down a little bit quicker now, but it won't crash. There's not loads of diesels out there so much now anyway. Obviously, the new car market has been moved away from diesel over the last few years. So there's less of those coming through within the data. But at the older end, there's still quite a few of them at that sort of 10-year-old point, and that's where the heaviest impact has been.
Yeah, surely there when it comes to electric cars, there's some real pressures in terms of, the government's completely axed the plug-in car grant now on new cars. MG have come out and said, they're stopping order books for their new electric cars because they've got too much demand. These kinds of things, they must start to have an effect on used car prices, surely.
Yeah, things like that definitely impact the used car market. So if you're looking for an EV and you go in and you can't get one, or it's a year-long wait or something like that, then you're going to definitely consider a used one, and that can only help used values. But as I say, they do look expensive, and we talk EVs, but you've got like the ZS at one end and the Leaf, and then you've got Teslas and other vehicles like Mercedes and things at the top end. So it's a really wide range. It's just a fuel type. But yeah, I think there's definitely more consideration there, and yeah, there will be continued consideration for used if you can't get new ones.
I'm probably it's not a massive scoop this, but I'm sure when we speak next month, we're going to be talking about something quite similar, aren't we? As similar levels of value drop, do you think?
I think so, but the only caveat on that, it is really difficult to predict because demand will probably drop away again. Supply won't be going up, but we do still have a lot of cars that do look expensive. So I think that's the only caveat on that maybe there could be some small drops, but I expect this plateauing to continue for a few weeks yet. So, but it's probably more difficult to predict because we're not in normal times, and you never know what's around the corner. We didn't see the cost of living squeeze coming to this extent. We didn't see the war in Ukraine coming to earlier on in the year. So. I expect plateauing, but I would, but there may well be some drops at some point that are slightly more, but not a crash. Definitely not.
Yeah. Darren, as ever, thank you so much for joining us this month, and talk to you next month. Thank you.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks.
Well, that's it for today's Car Dealer Live. Join us again very soon. Bye bye.